The presentation I'm sharing today is slightly different from what I normally do because I really want to be able to give people tools that they can use and can apply and can do something with. Um, I presented yesterday and I was saying to people, here is a model. You can sketch it down in your notepad right now, and you'll be able to use it to make decisions with later. I love doing that. But also on occasion, we need to step back and become a little bit more philosophical. And that's what today's presentation is about. So I invite you to not be thinking about outcomes and ROI or how this can be applied or anything like that. Rather, just consider the content, allow it to soak into you, think about it, what it means for how you see your own identity. A little while ago, I did a presentation, and there was somebody there from the States, and he had been involved in religious work before, and then he had shifted into coaching people, and he had some really interesting ideas about things, and we were connecting and talking online after we connected on LinkedIn, and then eventually he said, "Can we have a chat?" So we had a Zoom conversation, and his first question to me was, "How do you see your identity as a futurist, and how do you use that to serve?" And I thought that was such an interesting way of asking this question. How do I see my identity as a futurist? Because we all have different kinds of identities, different ways that we engage. Not that we're trying to be false, pretend to be one thing and then pretend to be something else. But when we engage with different people, we're engaging in different relationships. But for him to ask, how do I see my identity as a futurist? And how do I use that to serve? That was really interesting. And coming from him from a religious pastoral background, that was obviously a priority. And yeah, so I love playing with these kind of questions of identity. And it's an important question at the moment because around the world, there are so many people either exploring new ways to see themselves and how they appear in the world, and other people really kind of clamping down on older fashioned values, saying you can only be this or that, and we will tell you what you are. You don't get to decide. And I try not to be too judgmental, but I'm seriously judgmental of that. We get to decide who we are and how we're going to express ourselves. And this is another way for us to consider. So I'm going to go through the presentation. If you have any thoughts, pop them into the chat box. We'll talk about that at the end. And yeah, just allow yourself to play a little bit with different ideas. Five futures identities. And when we look at this, we're assuming and inviting you to be more conscious and intentional about the future. Not to assume that the future is happening to you or at you, but you actually have a role in shaping and designing the future. So when we become conscious of this and we become intentional about how we show up, then we get to start to explore some of these identities. And it's really important that we take the time to do that because we're in a world at the moment that is saturated with tools and frameworks and data. And we have all this information, but we don't know what to do with it. And people can spin ideas in different directions. But what we are starved of is the actual interpretation of what this means. We need to add our narrative lens to everything that we're seeing so that we can express ourselves differently. And the world, the tools that we have outpaced generally, what we're capable of doing generally is faster and further ahead than the majority of people's consciousness about themselves and what they're doing. And part of that is because of the pace and complexity of the world. I wrote a book about a year ago called From Future Shock to Polycrisis. And future shock is a term that was coined by Alvin Toffler decades ago. Future shock. It's about the pace of the world, how fast it was. And he wrote this in the 1970s. And if he thought the pace of the world was fast then he has no idea how bewildering it is at the moment. So that's pace. And then the polycrisis is the complexity, how everything around the world is connected to other things. And it can be quite, you take an action here and you have no idea of the ripples and the implications in other parts of the world. So a very complex world. And so we really struggle to keep up with that. And that introduces a number of psychological stresses to us, the anxiety and tension of the world. And it's not just for people with mental health issues. We all have mental health challenges now because of this. And that means that there's a question about ourself and our identity, and we're fractured. I already said we don't want to come across as inauthentic. We don't want to pretend, but we very often feel like we're fulfilling a role that somebody else has defined, and we don't know how to answer the fundamental question of who am I? So on that question, who am I? You're going to be thinking about that. But just for those of you who don't know me too well, let me introduce myself. I'm Charlotte Kemp. I am a speaker, a futurist. I'm very involved in association work and leadership. I work with speakers across Africa and Asia, and we're developing some opportunities for those speakers. So I'm a speaker bureau agent, I suppose, in that regard, and a coach. I'm always kind of working with different ideas. I write books, I prepare courses and webinars like this one. And when I look at all of those different facets of my life and the other ways that I express my hobbies, in my private life, when I think about all of that, I think, how do you frame that on a business card? How do you explain to people what you do? Because we're taught by so many people that we're supposed to be niched and focused and have a lane. And I don't think that's really possible anymore because things are changing so much. If you stick to one thing, you may not have the flexibility to respond to other things. So when I think about the work that I do and the work that many of you on this call do, I rather think of myself in my private place in my own mind. If I had a magical business card that actually explained who I was, I am a professional creative. I wake up in the morning and I want to create something. And that creation could be a book or an idea or a model or a webinar or a speech or a strategy to do a speaker showcase, or it could be some crochet work that I do or some other of my projects. But I feel the need to create something every day. And I believe that we are all like that. We can fall into the trap, and it's not a judgment on anybody because the world is designed this way, but we can fall into the space of just having to comply and fulfill and do functions to earn money to survive and forget the fact that we are actually creators. All of us create something with our lives. And if you just look around your home or your office space, your own private place, you created that space. And if you don't like it, you get to change it. You get to do something that is different. So think about yourselves as creatives. And what does that mean? That's a very practical level. When you're making a meal, when you're designing your space, when you're taking something away and putting in a plant or a painting, you are creating that space. But we can bring other worlds into reality. We can create other opportunities. We can create other paths for other people to enjoy. We create new worlds. And there's no better place to create a new world than in the future. So when we look at futures thinking, it's about designing those opportunities. When we look at the future and we say we could go in this direction or we could go in that direction, or we need to build some new skills, we've been very intentional about creating the future. And for those of you, again, who are speakers and coaches and trainers and facilitators and authors, you are very much in that space of creating the future, and inviting your clients to go along that path to give them the guidance that they need to create their own futures. So what is it that we're doing while we're creating this space? We're moving from this concept of control, which is really important to understand. We have data and we have dashboards and metrics, and they're good and they're necessary. But they're not the ultimate answer. They're just statistics in the end. They're just, numbers and data. What we really need to do is move beyond that control to a place of coherence, where these things make sense to us. We cannot have certainty about the future, but we can have clarity about the path that we're taking. And that's, again, a very important distinction. So we want to move away from trying to control and say, this is what I'm in charge of, because the more brittle we are about that, the easier it is for that to shatter, and then we have no way to respond. But if we can be more in a sense of balance and movement, then we're finding that coherence in our lives, in our thinking, in the work that we're doing. And that's what we're aiming for. We also need to challenge our concept of strategy, because a lot of people hold on to strategy as the most important thing that they're trying to do. They've got a strategic plan. They've got a 90-day plan or a 5-year plan, and they've got all the, again, metrics that we're trying to control. Strategy is important. We need to learn those skills, the strategy part, the tactics, how we're going to get there. But if we step back and see this as a bigger picture, it's not just strategy to move through something, it's stewardship of a larger space. And stewardship is not something it's not a word we often use. Stewardship is holding that responsibility on behalf of someone else. So it's not about us, again, controlling and owning and keeping something to ourselves. It's moving through an experience. For me, one of the most important examples of this is when I think about my children. I've seen other parents, and we see it on movies all the time. Every time there's a backstory where there's a bad relationship with a parent, it's very often because the parent is telling the child how to live. They're planning that child's life, whether they're still young or when they're older, and trying to influence where they're going to study or what kind of work they're going to do or who they're going to share their lives with. When parents see their children as their own, then they feel like they can tell the children what to do, and the children have to comply and obey. And I know that there's discipline, but it's not about that. It's about how you see that relationship. And I never realized I had a different approach to my children until somebody else reflected it back to me, because I met my children. I gave birth to them, but I met them. I never assumed who they would be. And it's been a constant kind of interplay between my 2 daughters and myself, discovering who we are and seeing each other change, and my children telling me that I have changed, and being able to still love the person who's now a fundamentally different person from who they were before. And now seeing those 2 girls who were so much a part of my life, seeing them have their own relationships with other people and with those other people's families, and not feeling hurt like I've lost something, but being deeply appreciative of the time that I got to be the steward of those lives, to take care of those lives and to support them until they can express their own lives in other relationships with other families. So if we can think of stewardship like that, it is an absolutely awesome responsibility, especially when we're looking towards the future. So that's moving from strategy to stewardship. And the last one is to look at identity. Again, because identity is such a fundamental part of who we are, how we see ourselves, how we express ourselves. What we have on our LinkedIn profile, and when we meet somebody for the first time and they say, "So what do you do?" How we express what it is we do, that's really our identity. But we can also stop trying to separate out identities in different places and put things into boxes, and be a little bit more fluid about this, and realize that there is an integration in different ways. So when I see my father and I'm the daughter, and then I see my children and I'm the mother, there's this integration of I'm still the same person and I'm still expressing myself the same way, but within different relationships. So that integration in our own identity and the integration that we have in the world and how we see different parts of the world becoming coherent and integrating together really helps us to see the future in a different light. All right, so we get to decide what kind of future we want. Very often people feel like the future is so big and vast that we don't have any influence on it, which is nonsense. And I know most of the people in this particular call don't feel like that, because I know some of you really well. But you know, I love science fiction movies. When we watch science fiction, there's anything about time travel. One of the big questions is, if you go back in time and you step on a butterfly, it could change the whole future. And then there comes that kind of trope comes from some movies. I think it might also be the butterfly that when it flaps its wings in China, there's a hurricane in South America. That kind of butterfly. It's really a dangerous insect, this one. But we assume that if we go back and we change one tiny little thing, that the whole of reality is going to shift. Why can't we think about that right now? Why can't we think that in this period of time that we're in this meeting, having a conversation and thinking about things, that we're releasing a butterfly right now that will fundamentally change the future that we experience, and maybe avoid some terrible thing that would have happened if we just sat back and let it happen to us. So we do have a strong influence on the future. I know that there are circumstances in the world right now that are huge and awful. And it's very difficult for people in that space to have agency over their lives. They don't have the choice of being able to take action and do things differently, and experience the kind of future that they might want because of the circumstances that they're in. That is a different conversation. We who have the privilege and the opportunity of doing that jolly well should do that. We should take ownership of the future. We should take responsibility in that, because it is in expressing our consciousness and our desire for the future in a deeper way that creates space for change to happen and for those other circumstances to be challenged, so that ultimately people in those circumstances will have the chance for a future that they don't have at the moment. So let me introduce you to these new identities. I really had so much fun kind of exploring who they are and what that means for us. So the very first one is the steward, and we've mentioned that a little bit. Then we'll look at the sensemaker, the person who makes sense of what is going on. The synthesizer is the person who brings all this together for us and helps us to understand it. The shifter changes the culture. And then the source is where we find the source for our identity and our future, how we want to see it. So let's go a little bit deeper into each one of these. You aren't necessarily going to be one or the other. We don't need to be binary about this. See what you can draw from each of these characters and what that might mean for how you see yourself, your identity, the work that you're doing, and how you see your future. So the steward is the person who has legacy in their mind. They're thinking about the legacy of what we're doing for the people who come in the future. This is a person who considers the unborn, the not yet born, the person who looks at the long view and wants to consider how our actions today will have implications for people in the future. It's also the person who looks at the empty chair. The empty chair is a concept of there's somebody who's not in the room. When my husband and I married, I had not met his mother, who had passed away before he and I met. But he tells lovely stories of her. And when she was in her 80s, she immigrated from the UK to come to South Africa. in the 80s, in her 80s. And she discovered her British pension could get her a really comfortable life here in South Africa. And she went out often. She could eat out at this one particular restaurant 3 times a week. She met with her friends there. She became an institution. The restaurant owner bought this cases of a particular kind of wine that she liked to drink that nobody else has ever heard of. But he had cases of this wine for her because she was there, 3 times a week. When she passed away, they had a memorial service at the restaurant, and her friends and family came together. The restaurant was shut to anybody else for this private event. And everybody sat there and they could talk and share, memories about her. And at the head of the table was her chair. It was empty, and her walking stick was hanging on the back of it. And I wasn't there, but I just feel that was such a beautiful picture that I have of being in a space and recognizing that you're there to include this person who's no longer with you. And if we can find ways to look at that empty chair when we're making decisions, then we're being stewards of opportunity and time and future and resources and access. They do not belong to anyone. They pass through us while we have an opportunity to take action. So that steward is making space for other people's future, other people's expression. And I think it's a beautifully gracious way to live. That's the steward. The Sensemaker is the person who can identify patterns, can see coherence behind the chaos, who can read signals and have an idea of what that could imply for other people. In leadership, the sense maker is someone who navigates uncertainty. And like I said earlier, with clarity, not certainty. We're not trying to gain certainty because we can't, but we can get clarity and say, there's a lot of chaos over there. There's unanswered questions there. There are things brewing in another place. We're seeing weak signals over there. And here are some options about how we can choose to respond to all of this chaos and uncertainty. It's a critical role. It's a valuable role. And I love the fact that this person identifies patterns. I've been learning a lot about ADHD and autism in the last couple of years and other neurodivergencies, because we've all been in a world that is being very neurotypical. So the world is, pardon me, the world is primarily designed for a certain way of being and acting, and we've all been trying to fit into that. And people who did not fit into the nice standard way of doing things were labeled, and normally labeled as difficult or uncooperative or daydreaming. And a lot of those people have been dismissed because they haven't fit into the dominant narrative and structure of the world. But the more that we're identifying what neurodivergent people are capable of, the more that we embrace any kind of diversity, the more we do that, the richer our experience, because people are coming to see things with different lenses and different expectations, and they see things that other people don't. And if we can put our egos aside and be open up to say, I'm coming at this problem with this set of experiences and knowledge and background and intention. And somebody else, how are you seeing this? And not defending yourself immediately, but being open to this conversation, then suddenly those patterns start to emerge. And we can act on the patterns. We can act on the trends. We can respond to that with more insight than we had before. And ADHD people, autistic people see patterns that neurotypical people don't see. And so we actually need to introduce them. For example, autistic people have very often not found it possible to have work in regular corporate environments. And in movies and TV series, you'll often see the very autistic person in like a basement room with all the computers around them, and they're a novelty. They're somebody that's kind of like gently mocked in a TV program. But in reality, there are now companies saying, we would like to hire some experienced IT professionals who have autism in the space because they bring something that a clever neurotypical person cannot actually bring into this networked environment. So now they're seen as valuable. So look at the way that you make sense of the world, the way you explain the world. And part of this sense making is not just looking at the data, but actually looking at the conversation, how we make sense of the world. What is the narrative layer that we're putting over what we're looking at? So that's the sense maker. The synthesizer is the person who connects everything together, understands the patterns, but has other data and can kind of pull it together. They're seeing the future through the systems and the structures that are in place. They're pulling together the strategy. Again, they're making sense of all that data. And I want to pause about that because we have a lot of information. We have a great deal of data. We produced more content in like the last 2 or 3 years than have ever been produced before. And now with artificial intelligence, we can create so much more and access so many more things and analyze so much more data. And we get all this, and it means nothing. It's not at all valuable until we can put the story to it, until we can make sense of it. So that's why all these different kind of archetypes are so important for us to be able to actually make sense of the world. When we first start reading, we're learning literacy. We're learning about the shapes of the letters and how they form words, and then how the words form meanings, and all of that happens when we're children, and it's quite amazing. And then we think, well, now I know how to read and write, and I know how to do maths. I don't need to learn any more things. But the more complex the world becomes, in terms of communication and media and marketing and advertising and propaganda, the more we need to learn media literacy. We need to be able to look at a headline and say, whose voice is this headline for? What are they trying to make us feel with this headline? When we read through the information, what are they assuming, extrapolating, glossing over? How do they want us to respond to someone else? We need to develop that media literacy. We need to develop more different kinds of media literacy now because of artificial intelligence. We need to be able to look at something and go, that just doesn't ring true. Or, wow, I'm so easily swayed by that. Let me just dig in a little bit deeper and investigate. Artificial intelligence is an incredibly powerful, useful tool that we should all be using, but we should not trust it. It doesn't just hallucinate, it sometimes outright lies. So use the tool, but don't rely on what you get and then just deliver it to someone else. You're a human for a reason. You've got to actually learn how to read that, pull it apart, put it back together again. So media literacy, financial literacy, artificial intelligence literacy, futures literacy. How do we see the signals and the information about the future? And all of this is brought together by the synthesizer who can actually make sense of that for us. I'm going to invite you to look at the shifter for a moment while I have a sip of water. The shifter is, beg your pardon, the shifter is the person who intentionally challenges or invites the culture to change in response to something. The shifter is a person who stands up and says, I'm not going to go down that path because it is morally wrong, because I can identify abuses. I can see how a bully is trying to make us take an action there. We're not those kinds of people. The shifter is the kind of person Beg your pardon. The shifter is the kind of person who would fire a client because the client's values don't align with the organization's values. The shifter is the person who would help the organization to work out that they have values and what those values are, and then go through a process of assessing whether those values are desirable or not, and then seeing whether they need to change. The shifter has a huge responsibility for holding that space in an organization, in a family, to be able to reframe the stories that we're telling, and to help people to see what is possible. Those changed conversations and narratives are right at the bottom of everything that we experience. One of the tools I love using is something called causal-layered analysis. And if you've been on any of my calls, you would have heard this in the past. But causal-layered analysis shows you this kind of iceberg. And right at the top is it's called the litany. It's the data. It's the stuff that we see. It's the figures on the KPIs and the quarterly reports and the sales figures and the headlines, in media. And very often people see that and they say, we don't like that, we need to change that. And they try and do something up here to change it. But the data that we have, that we can get, comes from a system below that. There's a way of selling. There's a way of doing business. There's a way of hiring staff and firing staff. There's a way of getting votes. It's a system. And you can't change the data, but you can change the system. But the system is based on a worldview of how we see the world, like dog eat dog, or it takes a village to raise a child, or every man for himself, or a rising tide raises all boats. These are worldviews that we have, and the worldviews are based on the myths and metaphors of how we see ourselves and the world, how we trust other people. And the shifter knows that you can't just change something at the top. You actually have to work all the way down to the bottom to see how we craft our identities for ourselves, where our wounds are, how we can move those fundamental things to something different. And then once we've got a different myth and metaphor about ourselves, we can create a new worldview. And out of that, we automatically create better systems, and the systems yield the results. And that is the job of the shifter. It's really quite phenomenal. And the shifter also knows that this doesn't happen with a one weekend, let's all go away and think about our values. The shifter knows that it doesn't happen with a motivational speech where everybody stands up and yells what their values are. The shifter knows it doesn't happen when you walk across coals that suddenly your whole world is going to fall into place. The shifter knows that these shifts change very slowly, and they change at the core of people's identities. So it is very slow, very unseen because it's so, so deep. But when it happens, it's a monumental change. And it comes with fear and anxiety and resistance, because we'd much rather be the bad old version of ourselves and do the work to be the potentially better new version of ourselves. That's really difficult. The shifter holds space for people, for clients, and for organizations to eventually get there. So very powerful role that. Then we have the source, and the source is really our inner navigation, what we tap into deep inside ourselves. The source helps leaders in an organization to get inner clarity, to develop their resilience, to consider ethical implications. The source is where we go when we're trying to answer questions about ourselves. So it's very much about self-leadership and emotional resilience and that inner clarity. And the ability, again, to give ourselves grace to look at a very complex world with so many things going on. Know that sometimes we respond very poorly to some of these issues, but deep down, this is who we are and what we're trying to, how we're trying to live this life that we have on this planet for such a brief time. So the source also helps us to unlearn those old patterns, to see them, because the the Sensemaker has identified the pattern so we can see that, and then we can decide how we want to change it. But we keep going back to this deep inner source. For some people, that source might be an external deity. It might be a faith-based thing, but for others, it is an inner voice that they are tapping into. So there you go. Those are the 5 identities. Why do we want to embrace these identities? It helps us to have conversations that matter. So instead of just talking about the surface things, we get to have a deeper conversation and understand things better. It helps us to design something that lasts longer. We're not designing in our work, I don't know, cool drinks and knickknacks and I always call them thneeds. It's from Dr. Seuss when they cut down all the truffula trees, and they just create things to sell so that they can get money, and they destroy an entire environment for that. We're not just creating something to get money. We want to create something that makes change, that has an impact on other people's lives, and a positive one. Because if the impact you're wanting to have on other people's lives is a negative one that serves you or your in-group people who look like you and sound like you and vote like you, that is not a conscious futurist. That is a selfish person trying to extract value from everyone and everything else for their benefit alone. That person is not trying to create a future, and they're trying to extract from that. In business, it means that we're recognizing that this is a living ecosystem, that there's different departments in a business, those departments made up of different people, that there are all these different facets that come together, and then the interplay between that business and other organizations out in the marketplace. And as we understand these different roles, it helps us to do better foresight work, better futures work for an organization, because we're thinking differently because of these. And while I'm having a sip of water, you can count your fingers. I loved creating these images with artificial intelligence, but some of them are a little wild. When we identify these 5 identities and start to play with them, we start to rediscover things that are really important, like rest and reflection and engagement and relational intelligence. We begin to see things that really are valuable, as opposed to just the bottom line and the KPIs and the things that other people tell us are important. We get to identify what is important for ourselves. But we only do that when we're conscious and intentional about creating this future. This is essentially a question about meaning. And I know that this is a tricky topic that some people don't necessarily agree with. We're often encouraged to find our meaning, in life, as if it is an external thing that is being imposed. Like, here's your meaning, and you're over here. Have you not found it yet? You got to get over there and find that meaning. Whereas I personally think that meaning is assigned. When we have an experience, we give it meaning because it's meaningful for us. One person may make a meal because it's nighttime, you have to make a meal, and the family needs to eat because you need the calories. So they make food. For other people, when they make food, they are serving the people that they love. They are creating alchemy and magic by putting ingredients together and applying heat and coming up with a new experience. They are using that opportunity for the making of the food and the consuming of the food to engage with the family and to share an experience together. And meaning has been assigned to that experience by them. So all of these things just invite us to really explore what that meaning looks like. Whether we're a steward, a sensemaker, synthesist, shifter, or source, we're engaging constantly with the world. I really feel always that I need to give you some kind of tool. So let me just remind you of this one, which is very, very simple. A nice little pyramid at the bottom. Our mindset is really important. How we think about the future matters. On our mindset, we can then start to use some tools, which is the practical stuff that I teach. And then once we develop and use those tools, we develop skill sets. So your mindset is, you know, can we create the future? Do we have an influence over the future, or are we just victims? What is it that we want? Are we clear about, you know, what a shared future looks like? The implications of us taking action, who else is ignored or included in that? So that mindset is really important and fundamental, because there is a huge amount in this world that we have to question and challenge and unlearn and discard, because it is wrong, because it has been imposed on us, because people have spent money, large amounts of money, and this is not conspiracy theory. This is like, I can point you to places. People have spent money to make us believe certain things so that we do that because it serves them, not because it serves us. And first of all, we need to identify that. And then does it serve us or not? And if it doesn't, then we get rid of it. And we learn something new. And even good things, even best practice and things that we've learned and things we've studied in the past, whatever got us to this point, whether, assuming there's any success in your life, what got you here will not get you into the future, because the future is different. So there's a lot of unlearning. Your brains have got a lot of work to do to reassess a whole lot. So that's your mindset. And then on top of that, you then learn the tools of futures thinking, of futures literacy. And there's wonderful tools. There's good practical business tools, academic futures tools, some light-hearted tools that we can use, but find a framework, find some way to kind of manage your thinking about the future. Otherwise, it can become quite overwhelming. But when you start being more intentional, those futures tools really help you to move things so that the future is better. And with those tools, and you play with them, you then actually develop the skill to be able to look at problems with different lenses and with different time frames. And that becomes quite amazing. So there you go. The future is not a destination. Our identity is not a destination. It is not even an unpacking, like, that there are things there that we got to unpack necessarily. There's no goals about this. It's a constant state of curiosity, a constant state of creation and of discovering. And that is the ultimate invitation, not to have a destination or a goal in mind, but to be curious and to be constantly creating. I'm going to pause now and we can see if there's conversation and questions. But if you do want to dig into this a little bit deeper, especially if you are working as a coach or a consultant with other people, then I invite you to have a look at the FutureCoach Sandbox, which was designed for coaches and consultants who want to play with futures tools and learn how to use them for their own practice and their own lives, but also to be able to introduce them to their clients without adding this huge layer of having to learn something. So the more we can play with this and discover and compare futures tools to other tools that coaches and consultants might already be using, the more we do that, the more easier it is for us to then apply that in other places. So the sandbox meets about once a month, but there's a lot of other correspondence around it. There is a fee to this, but it's not expensive. It's on the website, and I'll drop you an email later on to tell you more.